Hello, I'm John. Welcome back to Must Read More. Today I'm doing my September reading wrap up. So I think I read 13 books or 13 or 14 books in September. So we'll just dive right into it. The first book I read was A Demon Haunted Land by Monica Black. This was a look into some of the interesting beliefs that popped up amongst the German population after the end of the Second World War, specifically focused on these mass movements of faith healing, where people would come to believe that there were individuals using the power of God to heal people. And this kind of, I don't want to call it a psychosis exactly, but it was a hysteria that caused people from all walks of life to converge on one person who even just reputedly had healing principles. And it kind of looks into the psychology of the Germans after the war. She also talks about how apocalyptic beliefs started to take hold. And one of the topics in this was witchcraft, but that seemed a little bit weak to me, because when I think of witchcraft, I think of, covens and the Black Mass and all that. This was just really people who were using kind of spells and that kind of thing to give other people the idea that they could heal them or could give them salvation. So it was a pretty good read, though. It centered on a guy named, I think his name was Bruno, and the mass hysteria which surrounded him, and kind of his interesting life. He claimed to use the power of God, but he really liked to drink a lot of alcohol and party all night long and hook up with women. And to this day, nobody's really sure if he was just a fraud or if he maybe had some kind of mental illness that led him to believe he actually could heal people. So it was pretty interesting. It talked about a part of the war, the post-war Germany, that I had never really thought of, or I think that most people who are interested in World War II, for instance, I think that their interest pretty much ends in 1945 and doesn't really extend into the post-war years unless they're looking into the Cold War. So I had never really thought of the sort of the aftermath of the war on the German population, and it was just an interesting look into that. The next book I read was Robert C. Wilson's Icefire, which is about a bunch of prisoners on an island. Well, there's a very new prison for the criminally insane, all the worst of the worst. And one day they revolt and take over the island, and they get a bunch of guns and they start going after people. And there's a whole lead up to this. It was a very there's a whole lot of background in this book about the characters, which I thought was done really well, personally. I thought that development was done very well. But as the novel went on, I felt like Wilson pulled his punches. I felt like, particularly the ending, it felt like I'd read all these pages, something like 400 or 500 pages, 500 pages, and then he just pulled the switch. I don't know. It was just kind of disappointing that way. But I did enjoy it. I particularly enjoyed the character development. Um, it it reads a lot like a kind of like a Frederick Forsyth thriller, a 70s Frederick Forsyth thriller. That's what I kept comparing it to in my mind. Um, Particularly, I kept thinking of a book called The Devil's Alternative. Even though their plots are incredibly different, I mean, as different as you could get, really, I kept comparing it to that book and that kind of writing style. Um, the Devil's Alternative is a better book, but this was okay. It filled this need I had to read a long, slow burn kind of book. So it was pretty good. After that, I read Lawrence Block's The Burglar in the Library, which is part of his Bernie Rodenbar series. Bernie Rodenbar is an art thief. He steals paintings and that kind of thing, books, stamp collections, whatever's worth money in the art market. And we start with Bernie. He's hooking up with his girlfriend, and he tells her that he's got a couple of tickets to go to an English inn in upper New York for the weekend. It's winter time, and she tells him that she can't go because she's getting married on Friday, and by the way, I'm dumping you. So Bernie has an ulterior motive for going there. He believes that there is a copy of The Big Sleep by Raymond Chandler. The Big Sleep is by Raymond Chandler, right? I keep forgetting because I've never read anything by Chandler. But there's a copy of The Big Sleep autographed to Dashiell Hammett, and he thinks it's in the library at this large estate house. So he takes his friend Carolyn, and they go to this English style inn, and they get snowed in, and strange things start to happen. Somebody winds up killed. The bridge to get to the place falls into the creek. The phone line gets cut, and the whole time we're wondering who the murderer is and what's going on. And Bernie's trying to steal this book, and before all this, the woman who dumped him shows up with her new husband, so that kind of throws a wrench into it also. And it was just a lot of fun. I kept thinking of the movie Clue while I was reading this. It has that same kind of energy, and I just really enjoyed it. And I've picked up another Lawrence Block book, and I hope to get to that soon. So that was a lot of fun, and I was glad that I read that. After that, I read William Greenleaf's The Tartarus Incident. This was a pretty interesting book, or I enjoyed it. It was about in the future, people have discovered a way to travel in an instant from one place to another over vast distances by using something called the slipstream. And they use these pods, and something goes wrong, and the crew in this pod gets sent to the wrong planet, and nobody really knows where they're at, and they don't know how to get home. And on top of that, one of their crew members has kind of a breakdown. He steals part of the ship and runs off into this alien city he found, and they can't leave unless they find that part. So they have to chase him, and of course they encounter some pretty unfriendly aliens, and I just enjoyed it. It was just kind of a thriller, and it reminded me of the movie Pitch Black. It was quite a bit different, but it did remind me of that movie, and I just enjoyed it. I just needed kind of an easy read. After that, I read Douglas Reeman's Dive in the Sun, which is a thriller about the crew of a mini-sub who is sent into the harbor. I believe it was Trieste. I'm not certain about that. This was not my favorite read of the month, to be honest. I like Reeman's books, but this one was, I think this might have been my least favorite of his books that I've read yet. And they're able to sink this floating harbor, or this floating dock rather, but their sub is damaged and they have to abandon it, and so now they're stuck in Italy. This is right before the invasion of Italy, the Allied invasion of Italy in 1943, I believe. This is about how they attempt to make their way to the front lines, because they knew going into this that the invasion was supposed to start. So now they have to make their way south. And there's an improbable romance. They steal like a sailing yacht, and it just didn't work for me. There was too much going on. I kind of felt like Reeman should have focused the story around destroying the harbor, but that's the first 20 pages or so, and the rest of it just kind of seemed a bit like an excuse for him to write this romance. In all the Douglas Reeman novels I've read, there's always a romance. It doesn't matter how improbable it is. This one was the most improbable of the lot. There is a kind of a regional mayor of this occupied city. I mean, he works for Mussolini's government, and his daughter helps the crew of this mini sub escape, and the romance develops between her and the sub captain, and it just wasn't believable. It was just too, I don't know, it was just too out there for me. So it was okay. It wasn't my favorite book by far, and I did think at one point that I might DNF it, but I carried through to the end. I don't know if it was worth it in the end, but it was all right. Like I said, it wasn't my favorite Douglas Reeman. I really do like Reeman, though. Just this book kind of fell flat for me. The next book I read was Day One by Peter Wyden, Before Hiroshima and After. This is a difficult subject to talk about, and I'm having a hard time finding words to talk about it now. I think this is my 8th or 9th take of this. So I'm just going to leave a link in the description, to the video in which I originally talked about this. And if you're interested, you can click on that and hear what I had to say about it. So I wish I could find words for it now. It's a difficult subject to talk about. After that, I read Daphne du Maurier's Classics of the Macabre, illustrated by Michael Foreman. This is a collection of du Maurier's short fiction, and it is illustrated throughout. There's a scene from my favorite story in the book, The Apple Tree, in which a man becomes obsessed with an apple tree that reminds him of his dead wife, and he starts to hate the tree, and maybe the tree hates him, and maybe there's more to it than that, but I just really liked that story. And here is an illustration from her story, The Birds, which was made into the Hitchcock movie. And I really, I didn't enjoy this a whole lot while I was reading it, but it's kind of grown on me since then. And I may have to, there's a guy getting attacked by the birds. I may have to read this again sometime. I have quite a few of du Maurier's novels, and I'd like to read those soon. So, yeah, I really like the way this book is put together also. The illustrations aren't particularly my favorite. They're not really my style, but I did enjoy them, and I think that I do think that they fit the stories really well. After that, I read Agatha Christie's The Mysterious Affair at Styles. This was pretty standard Christie. This was her first book and her first Hercule Poirot novel. And I feel like it suffered from having too many characters and not enough backstory, and really not enough of a motive. I mean, there was a motive, but I don't think it was really well formulated. And there are just too many characters to keep track of. There are quite a few, 8 or 9, maybe more, maybe less, but it seemed like 8 or 9. And the characters weren't very well fleshed out, and I kept forgetting who was who. So it's not my favorite Agatha Christie novel by far. I think that she really hit her stride in the 30s and 40s. That seems to be, at least the books I've read from that period, seem to be her best work. The later, I've read some from the 60s and the early 70s, and they just didn't work for me. After that, I read Yondering by Louis L'Amour. This is a collection of short stories, which L'Amour kind of dreamed up while he was working as a sailor on cargo freighters, or cargo ships in all over the world really, but mainly in China and Indonesia and the Pacific. And he gives little kind of backstories before each story about what inspired his stories, and it's really, I thought it was pretty good actually. They're not westerns, even though there are cowboy boots on the cover. I don't remember there being a western in it, so it was pretty good. I like Louis L'Amour's short stories better than his novels, and I like his boxing stories, his train hopping stories, his sailing stories, the ones about bush planes and that kind of thing, quite a lot better than I like his westerns. But that's really just because westerns aren't specifically my thing. After that, I read The Reluctant King, Life and Reign of George VI, 1895 to 1952 by Sarah Bradford. I really enjoyed this one, and I'm not going to talk about it too much here because I did an 18 or 19 minute long video about this one. So if you're interested in hearing me talk about King George VI, I'll leave a link to the video in the description. After that, I read another Louis L'Amour book, West from Singapore. This is all about his adventure hero, Ponga Jim Mayo. That's Jim Mayo. This is an actual scene from one of the stories. Jim owns a kind of a small cargo ship, and he goes from island to island, and he works with a British officer in the intelligence services, and they work together to thwart these German schemes to take over these British Isles. And it was just completely over the top, unbelievable. You know, Jim Mayo is this smart, muscled up guy. He's good with weapons, he's good with words, he's two-fisted, he gets cracked over the head a lot and gets knocked out, and his skull must be made of solid steel, and he survives through these just unbelievable catastrophes. You know, at one point I think he sinks a submarine with a hand grenade, so it was a bit out there, but I mean, they were okay. L'Amour wrote these before World War II, and I think he sold them to adventure magazines. There are little backstories to each of these stories as well. L'Amour was really good about that. When he put out a collection, he would go and write a page or two about what inspired his stories or what he was doing at the time or thinking about. And it was just fun. It wasn't great literature by any means, but it was just enjoyable. It did get a little bit repetitive after a time because all the stories are pretty similar, but it kept me entertained for a day or two. The next book I read was Winston Churchill's Blood, Toil, Tears, and Sweat, The Great Speeches. It took me a month and a half or 2 months to read this because I wasn't in a rush. I was mostly interested in the wartime speeches, which are really good. They really have a power behind them. But, of course, speeches are meant to be heard and not read. So there is kind of an element missing to them. And there were a few speeches in here from kind of earlier in his political career that weren't quite as interesting or weren't as well written. But it was okay for what it was. The next book I read was Fortune Favors the Brave, The Battle of the Hook, Korea, 1953, A.J. Barker, by A.J. Barker. So it was about a British battalion in the UN forces that faced off against Chinese troops. The UN forces had dug in kind of a World War I style trench system, not quite as elaborate, and the Chinese troops would come in waves to attack, and that's what this book talks about, one single battle. And it was written by a British officer. I don't believe he was present at the Battle of the Hook. If he was, he never says that he was. Everything I know about him I had to look up. So this was not super dry or anything like that. And it was just a pretty good recounting of the events that happened there. And it was okay. I don't think I'd read it again because it really wasn't captivating or anything. But I do think it recounted an interesting moment in time of a war that people tend to have forgotten about. So that's everything I read in September. I had a really good reading month. I didn't read as much as I wanted to, but that's okay. Sometimes things get in the way, and that's what happened in September. And of course I've been making videos, and that's, learning how to do that has taken up some of my usual reading time. But I want to thank you for watching, and feel free to leave a comment or ask a question. I'd love to hear your thoughts on these books. And so thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.